Good morning. Let's get started. Barrett Nehus with Metagenics. And today I'd like to present, we're going to be talking about detoxification and revealing the truth and information about toxins. And today's presenter is going to be, I think we've got a issue with our audio. Test.
Hear you, Barrett.
Can you?
Yeah.
Good. All right. So today's presenter is going to be Dr. Joseph Lamb. Dr. Lamb is the Director of Intramural Clinical Research and Metagenics and is a board certified in both internal medicine and holistic medicine. Dr. Lamb is the past president of Integrative Medicine Works in Alexandria, Virginia, where he worked in partnership with his patients to create optimal health and well-being. He is an assistant clinical professor of medicine at George Washington University School of Medicine. He is also an adjunct faculty member of the Institute for Functional Medicine in Gig Harbor, Washington. Lamb has edited several books, authored book chapters, and co-authored several academic papers, and authored website presentations on a variety of functional medicine topics. He was also the author of a recently published chapter in the textbook of functional medicine. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Lamb.
Hi, this is Joe Lamb. Thank you very much, Barrett, for that kind introduction. What we're going to be talking about today is the world around us, because that's where the toxins come from, the burdens that are in our 21st century society. We've seen challenges that the generations that came before us never faced. So when we start talking about detoxification, one of the first things we would want to do is to talk about revealing the toxins. You know, the EPA estimated that over 4.7 billion pounds of toxic chemicals were released into the environment in the year 2002 alone. And in 2004, the Environmental Working Group found 287 different toxins in the umbilical cord blood of babies. And of that 287, 180 were known carcinogens, 217 were neurotoxins, and 208 had been known to cause birth defects or abnormal development in animal testing. So Teflon, one of these compounds that we think about being incredibly inert, turns out to be one of those compounds that shows up universally in cord blood of our children. Generations have never been exposed to these sorts of burdens. And as we see these burdens increasing, because every year, while not just the total amount of the chemicals go up, we're also seeing increases in the number of new nature molecules that are going up. So how impactful is this? Well, if we were to assume that their health effects at blood levels of zinc above 2 micrograms per liter, and actually, as Jeff Bland has commented on in the past on Functional Medicine Update, when it escapes me, but it was the expert on lead who he had been talking about, who had led the charge against leaded gasolines. There is no safe lower level for lead for neurotoxicity. But if you assume that greater than 2 micrograms is the level that health effects will take place, then 93% of the children in New Orleans are at risk for health effects secondary to lead. And this problem is so ubiquitous that in order to prevent lead intoxication, to prevent this, we need to think about the soil lead that's there. Additionally, you know, we used to have a EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, used to do a national adipose tissue survey. And stopped doing it in the late 80s, early 90s. And the reason they stopped doing the survey was because they kept consistently finding chemicals in U.S. residents. And it got to the point where it became just overwhelming and no new information was being found. You know, in 1982, the survey 33,000 U.S. residents, and styrene and 1,4-dichlorobenzene, xylene, and ethylphenol were found in 100% of the tissue samples. So we talked to our patients about water being a better substance for us than perhaps than a soft drink or perhaps than another beverage, but water itself has its own risks. Indeed, in water, according to the Environmental Working Group in 2006, tap water in 42 states is contaminated with more than 140 unregulated chemicals. When you start suddenly thinking about, well, should I be drinking bottled water? We suddenly have the concerns about the bisphenol A that is from the plastics as we reuse the bottles or as the bottles themselves get hot or when we cook with plastics. We have our health concerns there as well. And we certainly seem to be having an epidemic in diabetes, the rising tide of type 2 diabetes, the more and more cases every day, more and more patients presenting to the office. But interestingly enough, a couple interesting things have been found. One is in a study by Lee, there was a clear dose-response relationship between the concentration of persistent organic pollutants and the prevalence of type 2 diabetes. So what are organic pollutants? They're the pesticides, they're the herbicides, they're some of these plastics, and many of these actually have weak hormonal properties as weak estrogens. And they found a direct correlation between the serum concentrations and the prevalence of type 2 diabetes. Lim's group, following up on this work, assuming that a GGT, a gamma-glutamyltransferase, could be a surrogate marker for how many POPs you have. So if you've got lots of persistent organic pollutants, your GGT level is going to be elevated. Found a direct correlation between the GGT level in normal range and risk for diabetes in people with obesity. So basically, they looked at a group of people who were obese, and they classified them in either as being normal weight, overweight, the obese range, which is 30 to 35 for a BMI, or the high end of the obese range. And if you were in the low quartile of normal for GGT, then the risk as you went progressively up the weight scale was approximately 1.2, 1.6, and 0.9. So not really much of an increased risk despite elevating weights as you went up. But if you had the high quartile of GGT, your risks went up from about 1 baseline for normal weight to 3.2 to 5.3 up to 6.4. So the risk ratio was 6 times greater of getting diabetes if you were overweight and had a high GGT, suggestive of the toxicity. Similar type things, Agent Orange, one of the dioxin-containing herbicides from the Vietnam era. When you look at Vietnam era vets, and there'd be another one of the persistent organic pollutants, they found evidence in this paper in 2006 showing a direct diabetogenic shift occurring in the biochemistry of the adipocytes from Vietnam vets who had been exposed to Agent Orange. And in this paper by Jones, although little direct evidence links exposure to POPs and the onset of diabetes, their epidemiologic association is increasingly well defined, and the public health implications of this association could be substantial. We're moving down a path where not only the toxicity of too much energy in our diet's getting us, but all the other things in our diet are getting us as well. This is an interesting paper put forth about the negative impacts of the high fructose corn syrup. One of the suggestions is that in high fructose corn syrup, it's very likely that there's contamination with the herbicide atrazine. And atrazine, in studies particular animal studies show that long-term exposure to herbicide atrazine might contribute to the development of insulin resistance and obesity, particularly when the animals were fed a high-fat diet. And atrazine has now been used in the United States for nearly 50 years. And this is really the time frame that corresponds to the beginning of the present obesity epidemic. And as atrazine usage has gone up, the place where it's being used and where fructose corn syrup is being consumed overlap greatly with the obesity maps, suggesting that there may be indeed an association here. And similarly, in this paper by Gong, we see that diesel exhaust particles and oxidized phospholipids synergistically affected the expression of genes that correspond to those pathways of vascular inflammation that culminate in atherosclerosis. 1,500 genes were turned on and 759 were turned off when the diesel particles were combined with oxidized lipids. So this is going back to the regulation model. If we're sending messages that change how we turn on and turn off genes, we're going to get a different expression. The phenotypes of diseases are going to be expressed. And here, in a number of studies coming out over the last number of years demonstrating the endocrine disrupting chemicals that are a concern to us for public health. And, studies, for example, that show the decline in human sperm count and sperm quality. I point this out in particular because there have been people who basically have said, well, the initial studies were done in the 1930s and the follow-up studies were done in the 1990s and the technology was different. And so to compare the data is a little bit like comparing apples and oranges. Well, there were different methodology, but the methodology wasn't so different. It was more like comparing a apple to a Fiji apple in terms of the difference in technology. And what they showed was a 30% reduction in sperm counts and sperm quality over a 70-year period. So the conclusion from the Danish EPA in 1995 was that the conclusion of many of these studies is that man-made chemicals in the environment are expected to be interfering with hormonal systems in both humans and wildlife. Of coming out 2009 from the Endocrine Society, it's their scientific statement saying that results from animal models, human clinical observations, and epidemiologic studies converge to implicate endocrine disrupting chemicals as a significant concern to public health. And this feeds into a concept that we've been talking about here at Metagenics and has been talked about at the Institute for Functional Medicine, and certainly Jeff Bland has talked a good bit about on FMU of xenohormesis. And this is basically the concept that there are in foods molecules that, whether they're the pesticides, whether they're the hormones, or whether even the hormones the animal makes itself, all of these components in stressed food profile coming from obese livestock with unusual fat profiles because they've been farmed fish or meat or eggs, the stressed phenotype. And we can actually sense those signals when we eat those foods, and then we assume that stress phenotype. And it's just thing for us to think about. If cow is eating pesticides and concentrating them and having an endocrine effect which is negative on the cow, well, the endocrine effect is going to be magnified for us because we're also getting all the negative stress messages that dysregulation caused in the cow. So kind of a quick aside, if you're thinking about nutritional hormesis and the good and the bad, eating locally grown, organic, free-range, or wild foods is to be much prized over eating what could be parts of our normal diet, like the imported chemical-laced, caged, and stressed foods. Just something for us to be thinking about. Another big piece beyond the persistent organic pollutants and beyond the herbicides and the pesticides and even consumer pharmaceuticals in our groundwater, people have detected that there's measurable amounts, for example, of in our groundwater. Beyond all that, we got another issue, and it's the exposure to the toxic elements. And then this paper by Segovian, they comment that occupational exposure to heavy metals have accounted for the great majority of poisonings throughout human history. And when the papers coming in, the fact sheets from the Environmental Protection Agency, you basically come to the conclusion that we're routinely exposed to these toxic elements through our food, through our groundwater, through industrial waste, and through the exposure to industrial environments. I mean, just look at that slide picture, lower right-hand corner, and there they are spraying DDT at the beach, and the kids are playing in it. What sort of things are we being exposed to? What's leaching out of those tanks that may be seeping into our groundwater? What are they spraying? Just what has happened to all the mercury that used to be in thermometers? And it's important for us to pay attention to, because nearly all organ systems are involved in heavy metal toxicity. And the most commonly involved organ systems include the CNS, the peripheral nervous system, the gastrointestinal system, the hemopoietic, the renal, and the cardiovascular. And they're really a diffuse spectrum of individual presentations. And the reason why is because the organ systems affected and the severity of the toxicity varies with the particular toxic element involved, the age of the individual, the amount of the toxicity, and the uniqueness of that individual to deal with the consequences. And here is talking about the fact that the toxic effect of these toxic elements, of these heavy metals, probably reacts from their ability to interact with functional groups on proteins and essentially denature them, and to make these proteins function poorly. So they're saying in this paper by Sharma that the toxic scope of heavy metal seems to be substantially larger than has been assumed thus far. And certainly we have the connections between mercury and autism. And here we've got in a study looking at mice, that repetitive doses of thimerosal led to neurobehavioral deteriorations in the autoimmune susceptible mice. It led to increased oxidative stress, and it decreased intracellular levels of glutathione in vitro. Here, a paper makes a link between mercury and coronary artery disease, and saying that they found high mercury content in hair in people in Scandinavia, in Finland, who suffered acute coronary events. And they actually said that the protective effects of DHA and EPA may well be offset by the mercury. And this is just a reminder that as we encourage patients to eat fish, and as we encourage them to get fish oil, that we want to make sure that whether it's fish oil or calamari oil, or whatever the source may be of the oil that they're getting, that it should be a population of fish or calamari that are mercury free. And we need to see when we get fish oils that the fish oils provided don't have heavy metal contamination. And that's something that we Metagenics value strongly, and we can provide you information about the fact that we test. Here's a great paper by Mark Houston, basically saying that any patient with hypertension, coronary heart disease, or other vascular disease that would be thinking about addressing mercury and cadmium toxicity. Another paper by Menke directly linking blood lead levels and increased all-cause mortality and cardiovascular mortality. Here's a paper looking at groundwater in Michigan and making a link between elevated mortality rates for both men and women for cardiovascular diseases, cerebral vascular disease, diabetes, and kidney diseases based upon arsenic levels, arsenic in the groundwater. So we really have a situation which has gotten out of control. Many of us have no idea of what our toxic burdens are. Many of us go out eating the standard Western diet, being exposed to the environment, and slowly accumulating symptoms and aches and pains as we age and discomforts as we age, and we accept it as part of the day-to-day back and forth. So we've reeled the toxins, we've talked about what's out there, and now we need to start talking about what the solutions may be. Shine some light on what we can do to make a difference. Detoxification, according to textbook of functional medicine, of which David Jones at IFM was the lead editor, detoxification is any process of decreasing the negative impact of xenobiotics, both toxic and non-toxic substances, on bodily process. And the process of detoxification involves the biotransformation of endogenous and exogenous metabolites into excretable metabolites. So basically, it is detoxification when we breathe and excrete carbon dioxide. We've taken oxygen, a special compound, metabolized it, it becomes carbon dioxide. It is now a compound that is endogenous, but it's still deleterious, and it needs to be excreted. So, there's the 4R program. Well, maybe it's not the 4R. Maybe it's the 5R. Actually, maybe it's the 6R program. And it's a program that has been a centerpiece of Metabolic programs. And the first R is remove. What does your patient need to have removed for healthy GI function? This is a centerpiece of starting to think about detoxification. As with any program, as any approach to health, you need to think about lifestyle, you need to think about diet, you need to think about exercise, and you need to think about the mind, body, spirit. And in this case, the 4R program starts addressing the dietary piece and the gastrointestinal physiology piece. And the first R is remove, and it's to remove pathogenic microbes in the gastrointestinal tract. It's to get rid of allergenic foods in the diet, including gluten, for example. It's to get rid of inflammatory foods, fats that send the wrong messages. It's to get rid of new toxins by taking them out of the diet. It's cleaning up diet. Routine is getting back what the patient may have lost to support normal GI function, number one, like stomach acid, intrinsic factor, and digestive enzymes, but also to support healthy detox, adequate proteins so you have amino acid precursors, botanical support for phase 2 detoxification, antioxidants to address the oxidative stress caused by detoxification, potassium citrate, for example, to help clear out what we up to make it easier for the kidneys to alkalinize the urine so these acidic compounds can be pulled out. The third R is to re-inoculate. What your patient need to receive to support or reestablish a healthy balance of microflora, providing the appropriate prebiotics, providing probiotics to limit proliferation of pathogenic bacteria, the Candida, and the microbes. To repair, the patient need to support the healing of the mucosal barrier. To relief, what does your patient need to support? That question there is a toe. It's what does your patient need to support feeling better as opposed to support the healing of the mucosal barrier. Standardized herbal formulas that support stomach health, provide antispasmodics and carminative oils to address immediate patient discomfort in terms of IBS. Peppermint oil can be relaxing there. Rebalancing. This is an opportunity to remember as part of the 6R program, address the gut, address the diet, but also make all the other changes in terms of exercise and mind, body, spirit practices to lead to healing. So what does the body do for detoxification? One of the things it does is it makes metallothioneins. Metallothioneins are composed of about 30% cysteine and are one of the most important detoxification systems of all species. And in the absence of heavy metals or toxic elements, the primary role of metallothioneins is to transport zinc and copper and keep the appropriate balance there. But when toxic element levels increase, the role of metallothioneins is to bind cadmium and mercury, for example, and then act as a transporter of these toxic elements to the liver or the kidneys so that they can be conjugated and excreted. And they also work as kind of a sink so that the toxic metals bind to the metallothionein and not to the proteins and denature active proteins. So in mercury elimination, for example, metallothionein proteins in the cell would bind to mercury within the cell. They help the mercury be mobilized and transported through the cell membrane and transported to the liver. And then in the liver, the mercury would undergo conjugation with glutathione, which would be phase 2 detoxification, transformed into a mercaptorate. And mercury mercaptorate would be released into the bile, since it's water soluble, and it would leave the body through the stool. So, evidence shows that metallothioneins actually do this in animal models, and there is. In this study by Yoshida, they demonstrated that mercury vapor relevant to human exposure levels. So what that means is they exposed mice to mercury that would be at the level that humans could be exposed to. Actually, like from dental work or those sorts of pieces with dental amalgams, actually were shown to cause neurobehavioral effects in the adult mice. They had a group of mice which were metallothionein null, which means that they were knockout mice, were lacking the genes to make metallothionein. And these mice that didn't have metallothionein had greater symptoms, a higher susceptibility to the vapor than mice that had the protective metallothioneins. And one of the things that's kind of neat about the metallothioneins, as you would expect, is that they're inducible. There are things that tell the body to increase the number of metallothioneins. And one of the things that can do that, and has been shown in other studies, is zinc supplementation, for example. Fasting can do it. Exercise can do it. And what the picture page is showing is a large metallothionein binding, in this case, 7 molecules. Just as easily be a cadmium molecule, or they could just as easily be an arsenic molecule or a mercury molecule. And there's a study shown in 2006 by Ademir that zinc supplementation at 15 milligrams per day can increase metallothionein mRNA abundance by up to 2-fold in RNA from leukocyte subsets and 4-fold in RNA from dried blood spots. So they gave a group, and here it is, they gave a group of healthy young men basically grams of zinc for 8 days. And during those 8 days, they measured blood spots from those healthy young men and looked for the mRNA for metallothionein and how much it went up. And you can see in whole blood that it went up nearly 4-fold. The white lines are the placebo group, and the dark line was treatment group. So, of how does this happen? What seems to be going on? Well, there's a transfer factor 1. It's a role in the gene of that action of metallothionein. Zinc can actually bind to that, and when it binds to that, that can bind to the promoter and turn on the basically the production of metallothionein. And here they're showing that phosphorylation of MTF1 plays a critical role in its activation by zinc and cadmium. And when an elevated phosphorylation of the metal transfer factor 1 was observed under condition of protein kinase C inhibition. And interestingly enough, inhibiting protein kinase C is one of the things that hops molecules do, specifically the RIAA and the THIAA. What we've done at Metagenics in the past is, instead of simply answering the question that has been traditionally asked, for example, is there a botanical anti-inflammatory that we can use instead of COX-2 pharmaceutical anti-inflammatories, we took a different approach and said, okay, could we change the signaling? Similarly, here we said, well, what can we do that would make a difference? We know that metal transfer factor 1 binds to the metal response element on the promoter for metallothioneins, on the gene for metallothioneins. We also know that the antioxidant response element binds to the promoter site on the gene for metallothionein. And we know that the antioxidant response element also plays a role in a number of other genes, including the heme oxygenase 1, and also genes that play a role in xenobiotic detoxification, like glutathione S transferase and NADPH quinone oxidase. And so basically what's up is that if you were to screen for compounds that perhaps inhibit PKC or screen for compounds that play a role in upregulating NRF2, then you could make a difference in terms of your activation of these genes and their products. And for a product that we put together, which included IAA, spent hops, andrographis, and curcumin, and zinc, we were able to show that there was a 600% increase in the nuclear translocation of NRF2. There was a 700% induction of promoter activity, so the promoter being turned on for the heme oxygenase gene. It's a 30% increase in actual glutathione S transferase activity. So not only was there activity at the gene, but there was more protein and there was more glutathione S transferase to take place. And there was a 300% increase in NQ01 activity. So really quite impressive in our in vitro work, and that's in a cell culture model of human liver cells. So we went ahead and did a study, and you see many of our names from the Functional Medicine Research Center and from the Molecular and Cellular Biology group here at Metagenics on this list, looking at the expression of metallothionein mRNAs and what happened to the urinary excretion of heavy metals in healthy subjects. And here we see in the red dotted line, we see zinc supplementation alone. This just showing you Adamir's work again. And then there in the blue is what happened with our Meta 205 tablet, the combination of those products. And we saw a nearly 38-fold induction in metallothionein levels. And we saw changes, significant changes in the excretion of some important heavy metals, including mercury, lead, cadmium, arsenic. What you're seeing here is a multi-fold induction of mercury, nearly a two-fold induction of lead, nearly a two-fold induction of cadmium, and increases in arsenic, for example, in this study. And what we mean by fold is a one-fold, a two-fold increase would be 100% increase. It would be going from your baseline to double your baseline. And these were in normal subjects without a burden, kind of living normal 21st century lives, not having mercury in their diet. They were on a seafood exclusion, to eliminate mercury and kind of keep the levels standard. And they had baseline 6-hour unprovoked urines obtained, and 24-hour unprovoked urines obtained, and these were compared with 24 hours after having been on the product for 8 days, and a remarkable change was noted. So during the study, we saw people tolerated the product well. As a researcher, we happen to say words like adverse events. As practitioners, we'd probably say some side effects. During the course of that study, we saw, brief headaches, we saw brief GI distress, which had resolved by the end of the study. And that's a remarkable study because for the first time in humans, we demonstrated the utility of inducing metallothionein for both the binding of toxic heavy metals while protecting nutrient heavy metal stores. So toxic element excretion went up. That shouldn't say nutrient heavy metals. That should say nutrient element stores maintained, and at the same time the mRNA levels went up. So we took this work a little bit further, and a medical food was created called UltraClear Renew, based upon the work we had done previously. And the UltraClear Renew was created, and we did a pilot study looking at men and women with fibromyalgia, and as it turned out, we only recruited women. Fibromyalgia is much more common in women, and men had more confessing other illnesses, so they were left out of the study, the ones who had applied. So we had 8 women who met criteria for active fibromyalgia as defined by the American College of Rheumatology and had 4 or more dental amalgams. And there was a 4-week serial interventions that took place. So we started with the food pyramid diet with a seafood exclusion, and we followed that up with the food pyramid diet, the seafood exclusion, and daily supplementation with UltraClear Macro, essentially using the macro as a placebo. And then we followed that up with the treatment intervention, which was the modified elimination diet with a seafood exclusion and twice daily supplementation with the UltraClear Renew. Well, one of the things that really kind of blew my socks off was, as we enrolled these women, was that the food pyramid diet, which I don't consider a very good diet, I kind of consider it the standard American diet, was actually an improved diet for many of the women in the study, and actually in and of itself was almost an elimination diet compared to what they had been eating when they had been eating a diet very high in bad fats and a diet very high in refined carbohydrates. The clinical points that we followed in the study were the Fibromyalgia Impact Questionnaire and the FibroQuest, and secondary endpoints were to look at metallothionein mRNAs and to look at urinary toxic elements. So we saw an induction here, nearly a 1.6-fold induction in metallothionein levels. It was more gradual up through visit 5 on the side is the baseline, and at visit 6 people had essentially started on the product, and you see an increase in their metallothionein. And what we found for all 8 subjects was a statistically significant elevation in 24-hour mercury excretions. We found a statistically significant elevation in creatinine-adjusted mercury excretion as well. And we found statistically significant decreases in the FIQ fatigue subscale, and the FIQ pain subscale, and in the FIQ stiffness subscale. So for all 8 subjects, we found that mercury went up group, and we found statistically significant decreases in their fibromyalgia impact questionnaire subscales. And this shows kind of the magnitude of change, mercury going up, metallothionein levels going up. FIQ total score coming down for the entire group. We saw the MSQ score coming down for the entire group. We saw FibroQuest total score coming down. We subscales like the FIQ pain coming down. FIQ stiffness came down. Headaches actually seemed to go up for the entire group during the course of the study. But we saw some other things. One of the things that you can do during the study is you can, for change at the study, to the start of the study, or you can look at the end of the average of the second phase of the study versus the first phase of the study, and that allows you to see if there was statistically significant changes in the specific marker, like mercury or one of the scores. What you can also do is you can look for if there's a significance between the trends of which way things are moving. So those are called correlations. So you would look at two markers. Each marker may not have achieved significance on its own. For example, in this case here, arsenic didn't go up in a statistically significant way for all women in the group. We're expecting to see the markers go up because they're markers of excretion. What we did see is that the general direction of arsenic for the group going up was significantly negatively correlated with FIQ, which was going down. Similarly for FibroQuest and similarly for the subscores. And what I also found was that when you looked at the change from baseline at each visit compared to the value was at each visit, the amount changed compared to baseline, and looked at the correlations for how those changes were taking place, you see even a broader range, and now links between cadmium going up and various markers of symptoms going down, and lead going up and certain symptoms going down. And we found this to be true in ways, and it's really important take-home is that these statistically significant correlations were noted for the mercury and the FIQ total and the mercury and the FibroQuest headaches as you start looking at analyses, for example, of what was taking place during the treatment phase versus the final visit of the initial phase. So we also looked at a subgroup who had the highest level of amalgams, and the group showed very similar type changes to the total group, and these were laid out there. And I want to skip on, in the sake of time, to the subgroup analysis looking at responders. One of the things that you find when you start reading the fibromyalgia literature is that this is certainly wouldn't be enlightening to any functional medicine practitioner, is that fibromyalgia isn't caused by one entity. There's not one specific etiology for fibromyalgia. You're not going to find everybody sharing the same pathophysiology. So when the pharmaceutical studies have been done, they've consistently found that they just like one target, one etiology, and they don't make everybody better. So many of the studies have started looking at the question of how do responders do versus non-responders, and what is the response rate, and what would call a response. How much of a response do you need to see an improvement? And study by Rook finds some of those opinions. Finds, for example, that an FIQ score of greater than 20% would be called a responder. And this is really an interesting trial because this is looking at how many people had a response of an open-label study with Lyrica. Some of you may be familiar with the Freedom trial. This is one of the studies that was done with Lyrica pregabalin in order to get its FDA approval and indication for the treatment of fibromyalgia. And this was a really interesting study design. They basically took 1,051 subjects, started with fibromyalgia, and started them on an open-label ramp-up of pregabalin, giving more and more and more until they brought their symptoms under control. And after approximately 12 weeks, nearly 47% of the subjects had checked out, either because of side effects or because they didn't respond. They ended up with only 566 people, or 53%, who were classified as responders, and then randomized to the blinded portion of this withdrawal trial. And what's really interesting here is it wasn't the ramp-up, and it wasn't the treatment that was what the FDA based its decision on whether or not this was effective. It was the withdrawal part of the trial. So they put half the people on a placebo, switched half the people over at 566, half moved to placebo, and the other half stayed on the pregabalin. And the outcome was how long during the 6 months, what percentage of people 6 months later would still have their fibromyalgia under control. Well, if you think about the sort of side effect profile that you get, the adverse event profile that you get with a drug like pregabalin, and the fact that only 50% of the subjects could tolerate it approximately, then you've got to figure that people were able to tell the difference between when they weren't on it and when they were on it. So if you got switched over to a placebo and you suddenly started feeling better in terms of the side effect profile, even your fibromyalgia may be getting a little bit worse, you're going to know that you're in the placebo group. So how blinded were you actually during the withdrawal trial? And is it any surprise that the placebo group said their symptoms were coming back faster than the treatment group? And we looked at our subgroup and found that nearly 50% of the enrolled subjects not nearly 50%, but 50% of the 8 enrolled subjects met the inclusion criteria for a greater than 20% response. And they had very similar patterns to the overall group, but this was really quite significant reduction in FIQ total score, a reduction from nearly 37 down to about 22. This is a clinically significant reduction. A reduction in the responders from 50 for their MSQ score going down to the mid-30s. That's going to be a improvement that is of clinical significance. The FibroQuest total score, the FIQ pain going down, the FIQ stiffness, the headache score going down in this case. So we saw the same sort of important clinical significance there as we did in the other group. So the take home from all of those slides was that even in a small group of people, we showed a statistically significant increase in the excretion of mercury and a statistically significant decrease in the symptoms for everybody. And for the responders, we had 50% of the group be labeled as responders, which is very similar to what was seen in the Lyrica study. From a safety perspective, again, here I am as a researcher talking about adverse events, but, they're not really adverse events. That's what the Institutional Review Board would call them, but these are just the sort of tolerance issues that people experience during detox. We're all used to people having the kind of malaise, the kind of headache, mild GI symptoms as they clear, and here during the weeks, the 8 subjects experienced some of those mild symptoms that would be consistent with detox, or they had symptoms that were unlikely to be associated with either the consumption of ultra-clear nu or ultra-clear macro. For the purpose of a clinical controlled trial, if a piece of furniture in the middle of the night and have a bruised toe, that's considered an adverse event during the course of the study. So the 10 of 21 of these took place during the control intervention, and 11 of 21 took took place while the subjects were on the treatment intervention, which was with the UltraClear Renew. They were mild, they were GI symptoms, they were headaches. The moderate event was a increase in the severity of migraines in one of the subjects, which was not felt to be related to either of the products, but was related to the detox. And we saw no severe or serious adverse events, so the product was really very well tolerated. UltraClear Renew in the small pilot study, which we're going to be following up on with more studies, more women with fibromyalgia syndrome, is a highly efficacious, botanically derived, whole food-based medical food with a uniquely benign side effect profile for treatment of fibromyalgia. And, as we talked about, it's a product that helps with fibromyalgia because it's helping with detoxification. I've recently on a radio show with Dr. Stacy McCarry in Indianapolis, and we were talking about detoxification, and she had been asked the question by one of her patients whether or not UltraClear Renew was just simply AdvoClear, MetalliClear, and Clear Plus all put together into one product. And it's not, because what's different and what differentiates Clear Renew from the botanicals and from some of our other products is the fact that this is a product that has been shown in clinical research to both affect a physical marker like a biochemical marker like the excretion of metals, while at the same time affecting symptomatic markers, subjective markers. This really hasn't been shown in work in the past, and we're really excited about the connection between an objective marker and a subjective marker, and this is what makes the product unique, and we're in the process of writing the journal submission. And as we think about metallethionines, and to close, to beyond just toxic element detoxification, metallethionines play a really important role in detoxification. And here's a paper by Dong that was published in Diabetes in 2007 that says the high-fat diet-induced alterations in reactive oxygen species, myocardial contractility, and mitochondrial and cell signaling were negated by metallethionine. So upregulated metallethionines would prevent high-fat diet-induced cardiac dysfunction in diabetics. And here's a paper talking about the reduced AKT expression in insulin-stimulated AKT phosphorylation and decreased basal insulin receptor tyrosine phosphorylation are noted in the aged muscle heart. And that all of these age-related defects in cardiac contractility were attenuated by methionine overexpression. So, a product that raises methionines not only may help address some of the underlying conditions that cause the risk for the development of diabetes or the risk for cardiac dysfunction, but would also play a role in addressing some of the physiologic consequences of having those conditions. And here's just another paper by Ray making the same point, that both zinc and metallethionine protect cells against repeat stress in diabetes, and thus, by protecting it, prevent the progression to the complications, including heart disease. And just one more paper, Islam, saying the same thing. And then there's a paper by Jorn basically talking about that metallethionine and other molecule, a peptide modeled after metallethionine, have positive neuronal effects because they bound to cell surface receptors belonging to the LDL lipoprotein receptor and actually then activated signal transduction, resulting in neuronal outgrowth and survival. So here another link between the metallethionine, oxidative stress, the low-density lipoprotein receptor, and signal transduction. So, in conclusion, this is a player I'm hoping you have more sun than we have in the Pacific Northwest, and for all of us out here in the Gig Harbor area, it's also always interesting to look at a picture of sunlight. But the message here is do not go where the path may lead. Go instead to where there is no path and leave a trail. We have a unique opportunity, as Emerson's pointing out, to do something different for the patients coming into our office, to do something different for people with diseases that are consequences of living 21st century lives in toxicity. And we can address, using the functional medicine model, the disturbed pathophysiology and create new trails instead of addressing diseases the way they always have been, with allopathic treatments aimed at the symptoms and masking them. So I thank you very much for your attention during this last half an hour. I know for some of you it was the end of your morning, for some of you it was lunchtime, and for some of you it's been the start of your afternoon. And I'm really excited that I could spend some time, and I'm honored that you all spent the time with me today. Thank you.